a single imperial bloodline stretching unbroken for over 1,500 years, a warrior class that ruled an entire nation for 7 centuries, and an island civilization that sealed itself from the world, then shattered that seal to become one of the most powerful empires on Earth, only to be brought to its knees by the very forces it had unleashed. This is the story of Japan. What follows is the complete journey. From the earliest humans who shaped clay into the world's oldest pottery 14,000 years ago, through the arrival of rice and iron that forged hierarchy from equality, to the rise of the Yamato kings who claimed descent from the sun goddess herself. From the borrowed grandeur of Chinese governance to the exquisite isolation of the Heian court. From the moment the sword replaced the brush as the instrument of power, through centuries of samurai rule, civil war, and reunification. From the enforced stillness of the Tokugawa peace to the black ships that cracked it open. From the astonishing reinvention of the Meiji era to the imperial ambition that consumed Asia in flames, ending in atomic fire over Hiroshima. And from the ashes, a nation reborn. This is not a fragment. This is the full arc of a civilization whose legacy shapes the modern world in ways both visible and hidden, from constitutional pacifism born of total war to cultural traditions forged in feudal fire that still pulse through daily life today. If you enjoy complete journeys through the rise and fall of civilizations, subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Each week we bring you the full story of a world that shaped history. Let us begin where all of it begins, with the land itself, volcanic islands rising from the Pacific, waiting for the first footsteps. The archipelago rises from the Pacific floor like a spine of fire and stone. 4 main islands and thousands of smaller fragments stretch across 3,000 kilometers of ocean, born from the collision of tectonic plates that never ceased their grinding. Volcanoes punctuate the ridgeline, some dormant beneath blankets of cedar and beech, others still venting sulfur into cold mountain air. 80% of this land stands too steep for cultivation, too broken by ravines and volcanic slopes for anything but forest. Yet between the mountains and the sea, narrow coastal plains open toward the water, and it is here, along these margins, that the first permanent human communities take root. Around 14,000 years before the Common Era, as glaciers retreat across the northern hemisphere and sea levels climb to sever the last land bridges connecting these islands to the Asian continent, a people already inhabits this terrain. They are the Jomon, a name given not by themselves but by modern archaeologists, derived from the cord-marked patterns pressed into their pottery. That pottery is among the oldest on Earth. Deep-bellied vessels with flame-shaped rims, their surfaces textured by twisted plant fibers rolled across wet clay before firing. These are not the products of farming societies. They belong to hunter-gatherers who fish the cold currents, harvest chestnuts and walnuts from deciduous forests, and dig shellfish from tidal flats. Their dwellings are pit houses, shallow excavations roofed with thatch and supported by wooden posts, clustered in groups of 5 or 10 around central plazas. At Sanemaruyama in northern Honshu, a settlement persists for nearly 2,000 years, its residents raising massive chestnut wood pillars whose post holes survive into the present. Shell middens along the Pacific coast of the Kanto Plain accumulate over millennia, layers of discarded oyster and clam shells mixed with fish bones, deer antler, and broken tools, recording seasonal rhythms of harvest and movement. The Jomon world is not uniform. Across 6 major islands spanning subarctic to subtropical climates, regional traditions diverge. In the northeast, elaborate clay figurines called doge appear, wide-hipped, goggle-eyed forms whose purpose remains uncertain, perhaps ritual, perhaps medicinal. At Oyu in Akita, concentric stone circles arranged with astronomical precision mark gathering places used across generations. Obsidian quarried from volcanic sources on islands like Kozushima travels hundreds of kilometers by dugout canoe, evidence of maritime exchange networks linking communities separated by open water. For 14,000 years, this world endures without bronze, without iron, without rice paddies or written language. Population estimates suggest several 100,000 people at the culture's peak, sustained entirely by what forest, river, and sea provide. The richness of the environment, salmon runs in northern rivers, abundant nut harvests in temperate forests, warm current fisheries along southern coasts, permits a degree of sedentism unusual among non-agricultural peoples. Villages persist in single locations for centuries. Storage pits lined with bark preserve autumn harvests through winter months. Yet by the final centuries of the Jomon period, something shifts. Population densities in eastern Japan decline. Climate cooling reduces forest productivity. Communities contract. And from across the strait separating Kyushu from the Korean peninsula, new peoples begin arriving, carrying with them seeds of a grain that will transform everything. The world the Jomon built across 130 centuries stands on the edge of an upheaval it cannot resist. The forests and shorelines that sustained the longest continuous pre-agricultural culture in human history will soon give way to flooded fields, bronze bells, and the hierarchies that rice demands. The newcomers arrive on the northern shores of Kyushu sometime around 300 years before the Common Era, though the migration is not a single event, but a slow, persistent current of people flowing across the strait from the Korean peninsula over generations. They carry with them something the archipelago has never known: the technology of wet rice paddy agriculture, a system that demands cooperation, irrigation, calendrical precision, and above all, organized labor under direction. Within decades, the landscape of northern Kyushu begins to change. Forests fall. Lowland marshes are carved into rectangular plots, bounded by earthen dikes, flooded with channeled water. The paddy field appears, a human imposition on the natural world so total that it reshapes not only the land, but the people who work it. These migrants intermingle with existing Jomon populations, and the resulting culture, named Yayoi after the Tokyo district where its distinctive pottery was first identified in 1884, spreads with remarkable speed. Within 2 centuries it reaches the Kinai Plain. Within 5, it dominates Honshu as far north as the Tohoku region. The mechanism of expansion is not purely military conquest. Rice agriculture produces surplus. Surplus feeds larger populations. Larger populations absorb or displace smaller ones. Communities that adopt the new grain grow. Those that do not contract into marginal uplands. The material world transforms utterly. Yayoi pottery is thinner, smoother, more utilitarian than Jomon-wa, designed for cooking rice, storing grain, serving food in standardized quantities. Raised floor granaries appear in every settlement, elevating harvested rice above moisture and vermin. These storehouses become symbols of communal wealth and, increasingly, of the authority of those who control distribution. Bronze arrives from the continent, cast into ceremonial bells called dotaku in the Kinai region, their surfaces decorated with scenes of hunting, fishing, and rice harvest. In northern Kyushu, bronze takes the form of weapons, swords, halberds, spearheads. Iron follows, harder and more practical, forged into agricultural tools and blades alike. The social consequences are immediate and irreversible. Jomon communities showed minimal evidence of rank. Yayoi burials tell a different story. At Yoshinogari in Saga Prefecture, a massive moated settlement spanning 40 hectares reveals watchtowers, defensive palisades, and burial jars containing individuals interred with bronze mirrors, jade ornaments, and weapons, while others receive nothing. Hierarchy has arrived. Leadership becomes hereditary. Warfare becomes endemic, evidenced by skeletal remains bearing wounds from bronze and iron weapons, by severed heads deposited as trophies, by the fortification ditches surrounding nearly every major settlement. By the 1st century of the Common Era, Chinese historians take notice. The Han Dynasty Chronicle records that the land of Wa, their name for the Japanese archipelago, contains more than 100 polities, some sending tribute missions to the Chinese commandery at Lelang in northern Korea. The Weiji, compiled in the late 3rd century, provides the most detailed account. The land of Wa is described as a collection of competing kingdoms, the most powerful being Yamatai, ruled by a queen named Himiko. She governs through shamanic authority, rarely seen by her subjects, attended by 1,000 female servants and a single male who carries her food and transmits her words. When Himiko dies around 248 of the Common Era, a great mound is raised over her remains, and 100 attendants follow her in death. Whether Yamatai lay in Kyushu or the Kinai region remains one of Japanese archaeology's most contested questions. But the pattern the wager describes is unmistakable. Rice surplus has produced territorial polities. Polities have produced warfare. Warfare has produced paramount chiefs claiming sacred authority. The egalitarian world of the Jomon is gone. In its place stands a landscape of competing kingdoms, fortified, stratified, armed with metal, fed by irrigated grain, and reaching toward the continent for legitimacy and trade goods. From among these 100 kingdoms, one will eventually rise above all others, claiming descent not from any human ancestor, but from the sun itself. From among the 100 kingdoms, one clan rises. The Yamato emerge not through a single conquest, but through generations of marriage alliances, military pressure, and ritual authority accumulated across the fertile Kinai Plain, the broad lowland where the Yamato River drains into the inland sea. By the 4th century of the Common Era, their power is unmistakable, written not in texts, but in earth itself. The burial mounds appear across the landscape like statements of absolute dominion. They are keyhole-shaped, a circular rear mound joined to a trapezoidal front platform, surrounded by moats filled with water, their surfaces studded with thousands of clay cylinders called haniwa. Some represent warriors in full armor, horses with elaborate trappings, houses, boats, birds. The largest of these tombs, attributed by tradition to Emperor Nintoku and located on the Sakai Plain south of modern Osaka, stretches nearly 500 meters in length. Its construction required an estimated 15 years of labor, by thousands of workers moving millions of cubic meters of earth. No single chieftain commands such resources. This is the work of a state. The Yamato kings consolidate power through a system called Uji Kabane, a hierarchy of clans assigned hereditary occupational titles and ritual functions under the sovereign. The Otomo serve as military guards. The Mononobe control weapons and armories. The Nakatomi perform Shinto rites. The Soga manage imperial finances and foreign relations. Each clan holds land and dependence, but all acknowledge the Yamato sovereign as the apex, the one who performs the harvest rituals, who mediates between the human world and the divine, who claims unbroken descent from Amaterasu, the sun goddess said to have sent her grandson Ninigi to pacify the terrestrial realm. This mythology is not merely decorative, it is the architecture of legitimacy. The Yamato do not rule because they are strongest. Other clans possess comparable military force. They rule because they alone claim the mandate of heaven's origin, the sacred regalia of mirror, sword, and jewel passed from the goddess herself. The shrine at Ise, rebuilt in perpetual cycles of renewal, houses the sacred mirror and becomes the spiritual center of the emerging state. Continental contact accelerates transformation. Korean kingdoms, Baekje, Silla, and Goguryeo, send craftsmen, scribes, and monks across the strait. Iron armor and horse-riding military technology arrive, transforming warfare from infantry skirmishes into mounted cavalry operations. Chinese writing reaches the islands through Korean intermediaries, and by the 5th century, immigrant scribes record the Yamato court's affairs in classical Chinese characters. Then in 552, or perhaps 538, the sources disagree, emissaries from Baekje present the Yamato court with a gilt bronze Buddha statue, sutras, and ritual implements. The gift ignites a political crisis. The Soga clan, deeply connected to continental immigrants, champions Buddhism as a source of supernatural protection and civilizational prestige. The Mononobe and Nakatomi resist, arguing that foreign deities will anger the native kami. The conflict is not merely theological, it is a struggle over which clan will shape the state's future orientation. The Soga prevail. By the late 6th century, Soga no Umako has destroyed the Mononobe militarily and installed emperors of his choosing. His ally and protege, Prince Shotoku, serving as regent, issues the 17-article constitution in 604, not a legal code in the modern sense, but a set of moral injunctions for officials, blending Confucian ethics, Buddhist compassion, and centralized authority. Its first article declares that harmony is to be valued above all. Its 12th article insists that the sovereign alone is master, that there cannot be two masters in a land. Temples rise in the Asuka Valley, Asukadera, Shitenoji, Horyuji, their pagodas and lecture halls constructed by Korean craftsmen using continental architectural techniques. The wooden pillars of Horyuji still stand, the oldest surviving wooden structures on Earth, their entasis columns echoing forms that traveled from Greece through Gandhara to China to Korea to this narrow Japanese valley. By the early 7th century, the Yamato state sends embassies directly to Sui, China, addressing the Chinese emperor as an equal, a diplomatic audacity that offends the Sui court but signals a new self-conception. The islands are no longer a scattering of competing chiefdoms. A single lineage, wrapped in solar mythology and continental learning, commands the archipelago's richest agricultural heartland and reaches outward toward the wider world. The coup comes in the summer of 645. Within the imperial palace at Asuka, the Soga clan, kingmakers for 3 generations, patrons of Buddhism, holders of vast estates, falls in a single afternoon of violence. Prince Naka no O and his ally Nakatomi no Kamatari strike down Soga no Iruka before the empress herself, blood spattering the audience hall's polished cypress floor. The assassination is not mere palace intrigue. It is the opening act of a deliberate revolution in governance, one that will attempt to remake the Japanese state entirely in the image of Tang China. Within months, the new regime issues the Taika edicts. All land belongs to the emperor. Private estates of the great clans are abolished, in theory. The population is to be registered, counted, assigned fields according to household size, and taxed in grain, cloth, and corvée labor. Provincial governors will be appointed from the capital, not inherited by local strongmen. The model is unmistakable, the equal field system and centralized bureaucracy that made Tang China the most powerful state on earth. Over the following decades, successive rulers refine the borrowed architecture. The Omi Code of 668 and the Taiho Code of 701 establish the Ritsuryo system, criminal law and administrative law woven together into a comprehensive framework governing everything from court ranks to land allotment to punishment for theft. 8 ministries mirror Tang structures. Officials wear color-coded robes indicating rank. Wooden tablets, mokken, carry orders from the capital to provincial offices, their brushed characters recording tax shipments, labor assignments, and census data with bureaucratic precision. In 710, Empress Genmei orders the construction of a permanent capital. Until now, custom demanded that the court relocate upon each sovereign's death, a practice rooted in pollution taboos surrounding death. Heijō-kyo, the city later known as Nara, breaks this cycle. Laid out on a precise grid modeled on Chang'an, the capital stretches across a broad plain backed by forested hills. A central boulevard, Suzaku Avenue, runs north to south, 70 meters wide, dividing the city into symmetrical halves. The Imperial Palace compound anchors the northern edge, its vermilion columns and green-tiled roofs visible from every quarter. The city fills rapidly. Tens of thousands inhabit its wards, officials, monks, artisans, laborers, merchants supplying the court's appetite for silk, lacquer, iron, and paper. Temples rise at astonishing scale. Emperor Shomu, shaken by smallpox epidemics and political rebellions in the 730s, turns to Buddhism as a unifying spiritual force for the state. He orders the construction of Todaiji and its centerpiece, a seated bronze Buddha nearly 15 meters tall, consuming most of the archipelago's available copper in its casting. Completed in 752, the Great Buddha's dedication ceremony draws monks from Tang China, India, and Central Asia, a declaration that Japan stands within the universal Buddhist world. Yet beneath the Chinese-modeled surface, older realities persist. The equal field system functions imperfectly. Powerful clans and Buddhist institutions accumulate tax-exempt estates, shun, that the central government cannot reclaim. Provincial governors often govern in name, while local magnates hold actual authority. The Ritsuryo codes assume a Chinese-style meritocratic examination system, but in practice, birth determines advancement. Fujiwara no Kamatari's descendants monopolize the highest positions, transforming revolutionary reform into hereditary privilege within 2 generations. The court commissions 2 great chronicles, the Kojiki in 712 and the Nihon Shoki in 720, weaving mythology, genealogy, and political legitimation into narrative form. These texts fix the imperial line's descent from Amaterasu as official history, granting the borrowed Chinese state a uniquely Japanese foundation myth. The tension is deliberate. Chinese institutions serve Japanese sovereignty. By the late 8th century, Buddhist clergy wield dangerous political influence. The monk Dokyo nearly seizes the throne itself through Empress Shotoku's favor. The crisis convinces the court that Nara's temples have grown too powerful within the capital's walls. In 784, Emperor Kanmu orders the court to move, first briefly to Nagaoka, then permanently to a new site. The great experiment of Nara endures barely 74 years as the seat of power, yet its legacy is permanent. A written legal state, a literate bureaucracy, monumental architecture, and a civilization that borrowed a foreign system only to reshape it into something the original architects would scarcely recognize. The new capital rises in 794 on a broad plain flanked by mountains to the east, north, and west, with rivers flowing southward toward the Yodo Basin. Emperor Kanmu names it Heian-kyo, the capital of peace and tranquility. Its grid stretches 4.5 kilometers north to south, laid out in imitation of Chinese principles, yet deliberately distanced from the Buddhist temples that strangled Nara. The imperial palace compound, the Dairi, occupies the northern center, its cypress-pillared halls surrounded by white gravel courtyards, where officials gather at dawn for audiences conducted in whispered formality. For the 1st century, emperors govern actively, but the Fujiwara clan, descended from Nakatomi no Kamatari, who helped engineer the Taika coup, perfects a subtler path to dominance. They marry their daughters into the imperial line with relentless patience. A Fujiwara woman becomes empress. Her son ascends the throne as a child. Her father or brother governs as regent. Sessho for a minor emperor, Kampaku for an adult one. By the early 11th century, Fujiwara no Michinaga controls the court so completely that he composes a poem comparing himself to the full moon, lacking nothing. His daughters serve as consorts to 4 successive emperors. He never takes the throne, yet no decision of consequence escapes his hand. Within this hothouse of aristocratic power, a culture of extraordinary refinement emerges. The Chinese writing system, too cumbersome for Japanese syntax, gives birth to kana, simplified phonetic scripts that unlock literary expression in the native tongue. Court women, barred from the Chinese scholarship expected of men, become the supreme literary artists of the age. Around the year 1000, Murasaki Shikibu, a lady-in-waiting in Empress Shoshi's household, composes the Tale of Genji, a 1,000-page exploration of love, loss, and political maneuvering among the aristocracy, widely regarded as the world's first novel. Her contemporary Sei Shonagon produces the Pillow Book, a collection of observations so precise that the texture of Heian court life survives in its pages. The rustle of layered silk robes, the scent of incense competitions, the anxiety of receiving a morning-after poem written in careless calligraphy. Aesthetics govern everything. A courtier's worth is measured by the color combinations of 12 layered robes visible at sleeve and hem, by the elegance of handwriting on tinted paper, by sensitivity to seasonal change. Ox-drawn carriages carry aristocrats along willow-lined avenues, their blinds lowered to preserve mystery. The Phoenix Hall at Byodo Inn, built by Mishinaga's son Fujiwara no Yorimichi in 1053, floats above its reflecting pond like a vision of Amida Buddha's Western paradise, rendered in wood and gilded bronze. Yet this world sustains itself on revenues from provincial estates, shuan, that the court increasingly cannot control. Aristocrats and temples accumulate tax-exempt landholdings across the countryside. Local managers, often minor warriors, administer these estates with growing independence. The Ritsuryo system of centralized land allocation, already weakened in Nara, collapses entirely. By the mid-Heian period, the court's authority extends little beyond the capital's boundaries in practical terms. In the provinces, mounted warriors, bushi, suppress bandits, enforce land claims, and build networks of loyalty that owe nothing to court rank. The Taira and Minamoto clans, both descended from imperial princes cast out of the succession, accumulate military followings across eastern and western Japan. When succession disputes and monastic armies threaten the capital in the 1100s, the court summons these warriors to restore order, and in doing so, invites the very force that will displace it. Emperor Go Shirakawa attempts to play the Taira and Minamoto against each other during the Hogan disturbance of 1156 and the Heiji disturbance of 1159. Taira no Kiyomori emerges victorious, installs himself as the dominant power at court, and places his infant grandson on the throne. For 20 years, the Taira govern through the same regency mechanisms the Fujiwara perfected. But they are warriors, not courtiers, and their provincial rivals remember every slight. The elegant world behind its screens has nurtured beauty beyond parallel, yet it has also starved the sinews of its own defense. The swords it now depends upon belong to men who will soon wield them for themselves. In 1180, from the eastern provinces, the call to war goes out. Minamoto no Yoritomo, exiled since childhood to the remote Izu Peninsula under Taira surveillance, raises his white banner and summons the warrior clans of the Kanto Plain. He is not the most gifted commander among his kin. That distinction belongs to his younger half-brother Yoshitsune, whose tactical brilliance will become legend. But Yoritomo possesses something rarer in this age of fractured loyalties, the cold patience of a political architect. The Genpei War unfolds across 5 years of burning temples, cavalry charges through mountain passes, and naval engagements along the inland sea. Yoshitsune's forces descend the cliffs at Ichi-no-Tani in 1184, scattering the Taira garrison in a dawn assault so improbable it enters military folklore. The following year, at Yashima on the coast of Shikoku, he drives the Taira fleet from its anchorage. Then comes the final reckoning. At Dan-no-Ura, in the narrow straits between Honshu and Kyushu, on the 25th day of the 3rd month of 1185, the Taira navy is encircled. The tides turn against them, literally and fatally. Taira warriors leap into the sea in full armor rather than face capture. The child Emperor Antoku, 6 years old, is carried beneath the waves by his grandmother. The sacred sword Kusanagi, one of the 3 imperial regalia, vanishes into the strait and is never recovered. Yoritomo does not ride to Kyoto to claim the throne. This is the decisive choice that defines everything that follows. Instead, he remains in Kamakura, a narrow coastal settlement backed by forested hills on 3 sides, and the sea on the 4th, a warrior's capital, defensible and deliberately distant from the perfumed intrigues of the imperial court. He extracts from the emperor the title of Sei Taishogun in 1192, but his actual power precedes the title by years. From Kamakura, he appoints military governors, shugo, to every province and land stewards, jito, to private estates across the realm. The court in Kyoto continues to exist, emperors continue to reign, poets continue to compose, but real authority over land, taxation, and armed force now flows through Kamakura. Yoritomo eliminates his own brothers. Yoshitsune, the war's greatest hero, is hunted down and killed in 1189. The logic is brutal but consistent. No rival center of warrior loyalty can be permitted. When Yoritomo himself dies in 1199 after falling from his horse, power passes not to his young sons, but to the family of his wife, the Hojo clan, who rule as regents for figurehead shoguns, who themselves serve as military overlords for figurehead emperors. It is governance by layered delegation, each level drawing legitimacy from the one above while exercising actual power from below. The Hojo regents prove capable administrators. In 1232, Hojo Yasutoki promulgates the Joi Code, 51 articles establishing legal principles for warrior governance, rules for inheritance, land disputes, the duties of stewards, and punishments for crimes. It does not replace imperial law, but operates alongside it, creating a parallel legal universe for the warrior class. Kamakura's streets are austere compared to Kyoto. No gilded pavilions, but Zen monasteries where monks sit in silent meditation, their discipline mirroring the martial restraint the regime demands. The system's greatest test arrives from beyond the sea. In 1274, a Mongol fleet carrying perhaps 30,000 warriors lands at Hakata Bay in northern Kyushu. Japanese defenders, accustomed to individual combat and formal challenges, face massed formations, explosive projectiles, and coordinated cavalry tactics unlike anything in their experience. A storm forces the Mongol withdrawal, but the message is clear. The Hojo order the construction of a stone defensive wall along 20 kilometers of Hakata coastline. When the second invasion comes in 1281, this time with an armada of perhaps 140,000 men, the wall holds long enough for a typhoon of extraordinary violence to shatter the fleet. The Japanese call it kamikaze, the divine wind. Victory brings no reward to distribute. The Hojo cannot grant conquered lands because none were taken, only defended. Warrior vassals who bankrupted themselves preparing for invasion receive nothing. Resentment accumulates silently through the following decades, and when Emperor Go-Daigo raises rebellion in 1331, the system that warriors built to govern warriors finds its own swords turned inward. The rebellion succeeds, then devours itself. Emperor Go-Daigo reclaims direct imperial rule in 1333, abolishing the Kamakura shogunate after 150 years. But the emperor's restoration lasts barely 3 years. He rewards courtiers over warriors, distributes provinces to monks and princes, while the men who fought for him receive little. Among the disaffected stands Ashikaga Takauji, the very general who betrayed Kamakura on Go-Daigo's behalf. In 1336, Takauji marches on Kyoto, drives the emperor into the mountains south of Nara, and installs a rival sovereign from a competing branch of the imperial line. Japan now has 2 courts, a northern court in Kyoto under Ashikaga protection, and a southern court in the forested fastness of Yoshino, claiming sole legitimacy. The schism persists for 56 years, until 1392, when the third Ashikaga shogun negotiates reunification on terms the southern line will later call betrayal. The Ashikaga shogunate governs from the Muromachi district of Kyoto, not from a separate warrior capital as Kamakura had, but within the imperial city itself, surrounded by temples and aristocratic estates. This proximity to the court shapes everything. The shoguns become patrons of extraordinary refinement. Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, the third shogun, constructs the Golden Pavilion, Kinkaku-ji, in 1397, its top 2 stories sheathed in gold leaf, reflected in a still pond designed to evoke paradise. He sponsors no theatre under the genius of Zeami, transforming folk performance into austere dramatic art. Ink-wash painting in the Chinese manner flourishes under monastic artists like Sesshu Toyo, whose landscapes reduce mountains and rivers to essential brushstrokes on silk. Yet political authority remains hollow. The Ashikaga shoguns depend on powerful regional lords, the Shugo daimyo, to enforce order in the provinces, and these lords grow stronger with each generation. The shogunate possesses neither a standing army nor reliable tax revenue. When the 8th shogun, Ashikaga Yoshimasa, retreats into aesthetic pursuits and fails to name a clear successor, rival factions within the capital align behind competing candidates. In 1467, the Hosokawa and Yamana clans mobilize their armies inside Kyoto itself. The Onin War begins not on some distant frontier, but in the streets of the imperial capital. For 10 years, from 1467 to 1477, armies burn neighborhood after neighborhood. Temples centuries old become ash. The population flees. By the war's end, Kyoto lies in ruins, and the shogunate survives in name only. What follows is the Sengoku period, the age of the country at war. Central authority evaporates. Across the archipelago, constables appointed by the shogunate find themselves overthrown by their own deputies. Deputies fall to local strongmen. Strongmen fall to their own retainers. The Japanese call this principle gekokujo, the low overthrowing the high. A temple servant can become a warlord. A merchant can arm peasants and seize a castle. The old 4-tiered hierarchy dissolves in practice, even as it persists in rhetoric. New castle architecture rises on hilltops and river junctions, Yamashiro fortresses with stone foundations, multiple baileys, and garrisons of hundreds. The daimyo who survive are those who innovate. They survey land, fix tax rates, build roads, license markets, and recruit ashigaru, foot soldiers drawn from the peasant class, armed with long spears and eventually with firearms after Portuguese traders introduce matchlock guns to Tanegashima Island in 1543. Within a decade, Japanese smiths are producing firearms in quantity, and battles begin to turn on massed volley fire rather than individual mounted combat. By 1560, Japan contains perhaps 250 autonomous domains, each governed by a warlord answerable to no higher power. The emperor in Kyoto is so impoverished that his palace roof leaks and coronation ceremonies go unfunded for decades. The Ashikaga shogun is a puppet moved between rival protectors. Yet from this destruction, a new society is being forged, one where ability matters more than birth, where commerce funds armies, and where the man who can organize violence most efficiently will eventually reunite the shattered land. The man who will reunite Japan emerges from Owari province, a narrow domain wedged between mountains and sea in central Honshu. Oda Nobunaga inherits a divided clan at 17, murders his rivals by 25, and in 1560 defeats an army 10 times his size at the Battle of Okehazama through a surprise attack launched during a thunderstorm. Within 8 years he marches into Kyoto, installs a puppet shogun, and begins dismantling the old order with methodical brutality. Nobunaga's genius lies not in personal valor but in organization. He builds roads to move troops quickly. He pays soldiers in rice stipends rather than land grants, severing the feudal bond between warrior and territory. He embraces firearms with a totality no other daimyo matches. At the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, 3,000 matchlock men fire in rotating volleys from behind wooden palisades, annihilating the legendary Takeda cavalry in a single afternoon. The age of the mounted samurai charge ends in smoke and blood on that Mikawa plain. His wrath falls heaviest on religious military power. In 1571, his armies climb Mount Hiei and burn Enryaku-ji to the ground, the great Tendai monastery complex that had dominated Kyoto's politics for centuries. Thousands of monks, women, and children perish. The Iko-iki, militant Pure Land Buddhist leagues controlling entire provinces, resist for a decade before Nobunaga starves and slaughters them into submission. He builds Azuchi Castle on the shores of Lake Biwa, a 7-story tower sheathed in gold leaf and lacquer, visible for miles, declaring that power now flows from a single man rather than from gods or emperors. In 1582, betrayal ends him. His general Akechi Mitsuhide attacks at Honnoji Temple in Kyoto. Nobunaga dies in the flames, barely 48 years old, with half the country still unconquered. The succession falls not to Nobunaga's sons, but to his most resourceful general. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, born a peasant son with no surname, destroys Akechi within 11 days, then spends 8 years conquering or compelling submission from every remaining domain. By 1590, Japan is unified under a single authority for the first time in over a century. Hideyoshi issues the Sword Hunt Edict of 1588, confiscating weapons from farmers and monks, freezing the boundary between warrior and commoner into permanent law. He conducts a national land survey, measuring every rice field to fix tax obligations. Osaka Castle rises as his seat of power, its stone walls stretching for kilometers, its moats wide enough to swallow armies. Yet Hideyoshi's ambition overreaches catastrophically. In 1592, he launches an invasion of Korea with 160,000 troops, intending to conquer Ming China itself. Japanese forces take Seoul within weeks, but are driven back by Korean naval genius under Admiral Yi Sun-sin and by massive Chinese reinforcements. A second invasion in 1597 achieves nothing. Hideyoshi dies in 1598, leaving a 5-year-old heir and a council of regents already maneuvering against one another. Among those regents, Tokugawa Ieyasu has waited longest. Ally to Nobunaga, subordinate to Hideyoshi, he controls the richest domain in eastern Japan and commands absolute loyalty from his vassals. By 1600, the country splits into 2 coalitions. On the 21st of October, 80,000 Western Army troops face Ieyasu's eastern force of roughly equal size on a narrow plain at Sekigahara in Mino Province. Fog blankets the valley at dawn. By mid-morning, pre-arranged betrayals shatter the western lines. Entire divisions switch sides or refuse to engage. Within 6 hours, the battle is decided. Ieyasu stands as master of Japan. In 1603, the emperor grants him the title of shogun. Tokugawa Ieyasu establishes his government at Edo, a castle town on the Kanto plain that will grow into the largest city on earth. The three unifiers have accomplished their work across 4 decades. Nobunaga destroying the old order through fire, Hideyoshi binding the pieces through law, and Ieyasu sealing the structure through patience and political architecture. The age of warring states is over. What follows will be the longest peace the archipelago has ever known. The architecture of control begins with stone. Edo Castle rises at the center of the Kanto plain, its concentric rings of moats, 5 in total, carving water barriers through the flat land like the rings of a target. The innermost compound houses the shogun. The outermost moat defines a perimeter stretching more than 16 kilometers. Between these circles, the regime arranges its subjects with geometric precision. The innermost lands go to the Fudai daimyo, lords whose families sided with Ieyasu before Sekigahara. The outer rings and distant provinces go to the Tozama, the outside lords whose submission came only after defeat. Trust is measured in proximity. Suspicion is measured in distance. Tokugawa Ieyasu dies in 1616, but the system he designed outlives him by 2.5 centuries. His grandson Iemitsu, 3rd shogun, perfects the machinery of dominance. In 1635, the Sankin Kotai system becomes mandatory. Every daimyo must maintain a residence in Edo and spend alternate years there, leaving his wife and heir behind as permanent hostages when he returns to his domain. The cost is staggering. Processions of hundreds, sometimes thousands, travel the great highways, the Tokaido, the Nakasendo, carrying banners, weapons, household goods, and tribute. These journeys drain domain treasuries, preventing the accumulation of war funds. The roads fill with commerce, post towns flourish, Edo swells, society crystallizes into 4 hereditary classes. The samurai stand at the apex, administrators now, not warriors, their swords symbols of status rather than instruments of daily use. Below them, the farmers who grow rice and pay the taxes that sustain the entire order. Below the farmers, artisans who produce goods. At the bottom, merchants who merely handle money, despised in theory, increasingly powerful in practice. Movement between classes is forbidden. Dress codes, housing regulations, and sumptuary laws dictate the fabric one may wear, the height of one's gait, the foods permissible at one's table. Yet the deepest anxiety of the Tokugawa state is not internal rebellion alone. It is the foreign faith. Christianity, introduced by Jesuit missionaries in 1549, has taken root among perhaps 300,000 converts, including several powerful daimyo in Kyushu. The regime sees in this faith a loyalty that supersedes the shogun, allegiance to a foreign pope, a god above the temporal order. Persecution begins under Ieyasu and escalates savagely under Iemitsu. Missionaries are hunted, tortured, executed. Converts face the fumie, forced to step on images of Christ or the Virgin to prove apostasy. Those who refuse die by crucifixion, burning, or suspension in pits. In 1637, the breaking point arrives. At Shimabara, on the Kyushu Peninsula, tens of thousands of peasants and ronin, many of them Christian, rise against crushing taxation and religious persecution. They fortify the ruined Hara castle and hold it for months against shogunal armies numbering over 100,000. When the fortress finally falls in 1638, nearly all the rebels, estimated at 37,000, are slaughtered. The rebellion confirms every fear. Within 3 years, the Sakoku edicts seal the archipelago. Portuguese traders are expelled permanently. Spanish ships are banned. No Japanese subject may leave the country on pain of death. No ship large enough to cross open ocean may be built. Only a single point of foreign contact remains. In Nagasaki harbor, the artificial island of Dejima, barely 200 meters long, houses a handful of Dutch merchants, the sole Europeans permitted to trade. They are confined to this sliver of reclaimed land, watched constantly, forbidden to practice their faith openly. Chinese merchants operate under similar restrictions in a separate quarter. Through these narrow apertures, a trickle of knowledge enters. Medical texts, astronomical charts, mechanical curiosities. But the archipelago turns inward. By 1700, Edo holds more than 1 million inhabitants, surpassing London and Paris. Osaka thrives as the commercial capital, its rice warehouses financing a national economy. Kyoto remains the imperial seat, its artisans producing silk and ceramics. The peace holds. No major war disturbs the islands. Samurai study Confucian classics and practice calligraphy. Farmers plant and harvest in rhythms unchanged for generations. The system appears eternal, a society frozen in amber by design. Beneath the stillness, merchant wealth accumulates, samurai debts mount, and ideas circulate in whispers that the old order cannot silence forever. The merchant wealth that accumulates beneath the frozen surface of Tokugawa order does not remain hidden. It erupts into color, sound, spectacle, and ink. The 18th century belongs not to the samurai who nominally rule, but to the chonin, the townspeople of Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto, who transform surplus rice profits into a culture of astonishing vitality. In Osaka's Dojima district, rice brokers gather before dawn in a long wooden hall. Here, since 1730, futures contracts trade on rice not yet harvested, merchants buying and selling warehouse receipts representing bales stored across the country. The system functions as the world's first organized futures exchange, its price signals radiating outward to every domain. A samurai's stipend, paid in rice, depends on rates set by commoners he officially outranks. The contradiction gnaws at the social order daily. Edo's Yoshiwara pleasure quarter glows behind its moat and single gate. Lanterns hang in rows along the central boulevard, illuminating courtesans in layered silk, whose elaborate hairstyles require hours of preparation. This walled district operates under shogunal license, vice-contained, taxed, and surveilled. Yet Yoshiwara generates art. Ukiyo-e woodblock print masters, Hishikawa Moronobu, later Suzuki Harunobu, and eventually Kitagawa Utamaro, render its inhabitants in flowing lines and flat planes of color that will, a century hence, astonish European painters. Kabuki theater thrives in the licensed playhouses of all 3 great cities. Male actors specialize across lifetimes in female roles, the Onagata tradition producing performers of extraordinary refinement. Audiences pack wooden galleries for day-long performances, combining dance, music, melodrama, and spectacle. The playwright Chikamatsu Monzemon, working in the puppet theater of Osaka, crafts tragedies of merchants torn between duty and passion, stories the samurai class officially disdains, but privately consumes. Beyond the cities, 80% of the population labors in villages. A headman manages tax collection, typically 40% of the rice harvest forwarded to the domain lord. Families live in timber-framed houses with earthen floors and raised tatami rooms reserved for formal occasions. Festivals mark planting and harvest. Buddhist temples register births and deaths. Travel requires permits, yet pilgrimage to Ise Shrine provides a sanctioned escape. Millions undertake the journey across the Tokugawa centuries. Intellectual currents flow beneath official orthodoxy. In Matsusaka, the scholar Motori Norinaga spends 35 years producing his commentary on the Kojiki, completed in 1798. A monumental work arguing that Japan's ancient texts reveal a pure national spirit corrupted by Chinese philosophical imports. This Kokugaku movement quietly undermines the Confucian ideology, sustaining Tokugawa legitimacy, redirecting reverence toward the emperor in Kyoto rather than the shogun in Edo. Simultaneously, in Nagasaki, a handful of interpreters and physicians studied Dutch texts arriving through Dejima. Sugita Genpaku's dissection of a corpse in 1771, compared against a Dutch anatomical atlas, reveals that Western medical illustrations are accurate where Chinese traditional diagrams are not. His resulting publication, Kaitai Shinsho of 1774, opens a flood of rangaku, Dutch learning, encompassing astronomy, chemistry, geography, and military science. Famine tests the system's resilience. The Tenmei crisis of 1782 to 1788, triggered by volcanic eruption and crop failure, kills perhaps 900,000 people in the northern domains. Rice riots erupt in Edo and Osaka. The shogunate responds with sumptuary laws and moral exhortation rather than structural reform. Debt cancellation edicts, tokusei, temporarily relieve samurai creditors, but destroy merchant confidence. Katsushika Hokusai, born in 1760, spends 7 decades producing images that distill the Tokugawa world into visual permanence. His 36 views of Mount Fuji, published in the early 1830s, captures fishermen, travelers, and craftsmen dwarfed by nature and wave. The Great Wave off Kanagawa becomes the single most recognized image of Japan, a nation defined by the sea that surrounds it. By 1800, literacy rates in Japan rival or exceed those of contemporary Europe. Terracotta temple schools educate commoners in reading, writing, and arithmetic. Books circulate through lending libraries. A reading public exists, informed, curious, and increasingly aware that beyond the closed borders, a wider world moves at accelerating speed. On the 8th of July, 1853, 4 vessels appear off the coast of Uraga at the entrance to Edo Bay. 2 of them move without sails. Black hulls cut through the water trailing columns of coal smoke, their paddle wheels churning against the current. The steam frigates Mississippi and Susquehanna, accompanied by 2 sailing sloops, carry Commodore Matthew Calbraith Perry of the United States Navy, and a letter from President Millard Fillmore demanding that Japan open its ports to American trade, provide coal and provisions to whaling ships, and guarantee the safety of shipwrecked sailors. The local magistrates' boats swarm around the squadron but cannot approach. Perry refuses all intermediaries below the rank of a senior official. His guns, 73 cannons across the 4 ships, remain visible, their muzzles uncovered. The shogunate has no answer. For 212 years, the Sakoku edicts have kept the world at a distance. Now the world has arrived with steam power, explosive shells, and demands written in English and Dutch. The senior counselors in Edo Castle take the unprecedented step of circulating Peri's letter among the daimyo, soliciting opinions, an admission of paralysis that shatters the fiction of shogunal omnipotence. Peri departs, promising to return the following year with a larger fleet for Japan's reply. He returns in February of 1854 with 9 warships. On the 31st of March, the Treaty of Kanagawa is signed, opening the ports of Shimoda and Hakodate to American vessels. It is not a trade agreement but a crack in the wall. Within 4 years, Townsend Harris, the first American consul, negotiates a full commercial treaty, the Harris Treaty of 1858, imposing extraterritorial rights for foreign nationals, fixed low tariffs Japan cannot adjust, and the opening of additional ports including Yokohama and Kobe. Similar treaties follow with Britain, France, Russia, and the Netherlands. These unequal treaties strip Japan of tariff autonomy and legal sovereignty over foreigners on its own soil. The political earthquake radiates outward. The phrase "sono joy," revere the emperor, expel the barbarians, becomes the rallying cry of young samurai in the powerful southwestern domains of Satsuma and Choshu. They see the shogunate's capitulation as proof of its illegitimacy. In Kyoto, Ronin assassins strike down shogunal officials and merchants associated with foreign trade. The streets of the imperial capital become killing grounds. Choshu Domain fires on Western shipping in the Straits of Shimonoseki in 1863. A combined fleet of British, French, Dutch, and American warships retaliates in September 1864, destroying the domain's coastal batteries in hours. Satsuma learns the same lesson a year earlier when British warships bombard Kagoshima after the Namamugi incident. The message is identical in both cases: expulsion is impossible. The most radical anti-foreign domains pivot with stunning speed. Rather than reject Western power, they resolve to acquire it. Satsuma and Choshu, bitter rivals for generations, form a secret alliance in 1866, brokered by the samurai Sakamoto Ryoma. They purchase modern rifles and artillery through foreign merchants. The last shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, attempts reform, restructuring the military along French lines, proposing a council of daimyo, but the ground has shifted beneath him. On the 9th of November, 1867, he formally returns governing authority to the emperor in the act known as Taisei Hokan. It is not enough. On the 3rd of January, 1868, forces loyal to Satsuma and Choshu seize the imperial palace in Kyoto and proclaim the restoration of direct imperial rule in the name of the 15-year-old Emperor Meiji. The Boshin War follows. Shogunal loyalists resist through the spring of 1869, their last stand at the star-shaped fortress of Goryokaku in Hakodate on Hokkaido. They are defeated. The Charter Oath, issued on the 6th of April, 1868, declares that deliberative assemblies shall be established, all matters decided by public discussion, and evil customs of the past abandoned. 7 centuries of warrior government end not with the slow erosion of decades, but with the sharp crack of 15 years. The boy emperor sits in Kyoto in layered ceremonial robes, a living symbol around which an entirely new state will be constructed from the wreckage of the old. The demolition begins before the new structure is even designed. In 1871, the Meiji government issues the decree of Heihan Chiken, the abolition of domains. 260 feudal territories that had governed Japan for over 2 centuries vanish in a single administrative stroke, replaced by prefectures administered by centrally appointed governors. The daimyo, lords who commanded armies and collected taxes across hereditary lands, are summoned to Tokyo, the renamed capital, and pensioned off. Their castles become government offices or stand empty, stone walls enclosing silence where retainers once drilled. The samurai class itself follows. Stipends that consumed nearly half of government revenue are commuted into bonds between 1873 and 1876. The sword-bearing privilege is abolished in 1876 by the Haitore Edict. Men whose families had defined themselves through martial service for 7 centuries cut their top knots, exchange silk hakama for Western suits, and find themselves adrift in a society that no longer requires their existence. Some become bureaucrats, teachers, policemen. Many descend into poverty. Not all submit quietly. In 1877, Saigo Takamori, the great Satsuma hero who had helped overthrow the shogunate, leads approximately 30,000 disaffected samurai in open rebellion. The Satsuma Rebellion tests the new conscript army, composed largely of commoner farmers trained in Western drill and armed with modern rifles. At the siege of Kumamoto Castle and across the hills of Kyushu, peasant conscripts defeat samurai warriors. Saigo dies in September 1877, and with him dies the last armed resistance to the new order. The age of the sword is finished. Meanwhile, the Iwakura mission of 1871 to 1873 carries nearly half the senior leadership abroad. 48 officials and over 50 students touring the United States, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and 11 other nations for 21 months. They inspect shipyards in Glasgow, parliaments in Westminster, factories in Manchester, military academies in Berlin. They return convinced that industrialization and constitutional governance are inseparable from national strength, and that Japan has perhaps 20 years to achieve what Europe built over a century. The state becomes the engine of transformation. Government-funded model factories rise. The Tomioka silk mill opens in 1872 with French machinery and French engineers. Arsenals at Tokyo and Osaka produce modern artillery. Railways connect Tokyo to Yokohama by 1872, then extend outward like iron nerves. Telegraph lines follow. A national postal system begins in 1871. Universal conscription is enacted in 1873. Compulsory education follows in 1872, aiming to eliminate illiteracy within a generation. The political architecture takes longer. The freedom and people's rights movement demands representative government throughout the 1870s and 80s. Ito Hirobumi studies constitutional models in Europe, spending months in Berlin absorbing Prussian theory. On the 11th of February, 1889, Emperor Meiji promulgates the Constitution of the Empire of Japan, a document granting a bicameral imperial diet while preserving imperial sovereignty and executive prerogative. It is Asia's first modern constitution. By 1894, the transformation faces its ultimate test. Disputes over influence in Korea bring Japan into war with Qing China. The conscript army, despised by samurai traditionalists just 17 years earlier, crushes Chinese forces at Pyongyang in September and the Yalu River in October. The Navy destroys the Beiyang fleet. The Treaty of Shimonoseki, signed on the 17th of April 1895, cedes Taiwan to Japan, recognizes Korean independence from Chinese suzerainty, and extracts an enormous indemnity. a feudal archipelago has become an imperial power in 27 years. The cost is measured not only in treasury expenditures and military dead, but in an entire class of people erased, an ancient social order dissolved, and a nation remade so thoroughly that its own past becomes foreign territory. The indemnity from China funds what comes next. Silvertails flow into naval shipyards at Kure and Sasebo, into arsenals forging artillery barrels, into the expansion of a fleet that within a decade will challenge the largest navy ever to sail from European waters. The triple intervention of 1895, when Russia, France, and Germany forced Japan to return the Liaodong Peninsula to China, burns into the national consciousness as a humiliation delivered by powers who themselves carve concessions from the same weakened Qing state. The lesson is absorbed without ambiguity. Only superior force commands respect among empires. Russia becomes the primary threat. Its Trans-Siberian Railway pushes eastward. Its troops occupy Manchuria during the Boxer Rebellion of 1900 and do not leave. Russian timber concessions creep toward the Yalu River, pressing against Korean territory that Japan considers vital to its own security. Diplomacy fails. On the 8th of February 1904, Japanese torpedo boats strike the Russian Pacific Squadron at anchor in Port Arthur without a declaration of war. The conflict that follows astonishes the world. The Anglo-Japanese alliance of 1902, the first military pact between a European power and an Asian nation, ensures that no other European state will intervene on Russia's behalf. Britain's calculation is strategic. Japan checks Russian expansion in East Asia, while the Royal Navy concentrates in home waters against Germany. For Japan, the alliance confers legitimacy, access to British shipbuilding expertise, and the diplomatic isolation of its enemy. The war unfolds across Manchurian plains and frigid seas. Japanese armies besiege Port Arthur for 5 months at staggering cost, nearly 60,000 casualties before the fortress falls in January 1905. At Mukden in March, 300,000 Japanese soldiers engage Russian forces in the largest land battle the world has yet seen. The decisive blow comes at sea. On the 27th of May 1905, Admiral Togo Heihachiro, standing on the bridge of his flagship Mikasa, crosses the T of the Russian Baltic Fleet, renamed the 2nd Pacific Squadron after its 18,000-mile voyage around Africa and Asia. In a single afternoon at Tsushima Strait, Japanese gunnery destroys or captures virtually the entire Russian force. 21 Russian ships sink. Japan loses 3 torpedo boats. The Treaty of Portsmouth, mediated by the United States President in September 1905, grants Japan the southern half of Sakhalin, Russian leases in Manchuria, and recognition of paramount interest in Korea. No indemnity is extracted, a fact that triggers riots in Tokyo, where crowds burn police stations and churches, furious that blood spent has not been fully compensated. Yet the strategic reality is transformative. An Asian nation has defeated a European empire in modern industrial warfare. The global racial hierarchy that underpins colonial order cracks, even as Japan itself prepares to become a colonial power. Korea falls in stages. A protectorate is imposed in 1905. Resident General Ito Hirobumi oversees the dismantling of Korean sovereignty until his assassination by Korean nationalist An Jung-geun in Harbin in 1909 accelerates the final step. On the 22nd of August 1910, the Annexation Treaty extinguishes the Korean state entirely. Japanese administrators impose land surveys that dispossess farmers, suppress Korean language instruction, and extract rice for export to the home islands. When war erupts in Europe in 1914, Japan enters on the Allied side under the Anglo-Japanese alliance, seizing German holdings in Shandong Province and Pacific Island chains, the Marshalls, Carolines, Marianas. The 21 demands presented to China in 1915 reveal ambitions that alarm even allies. At the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, Japanese delegates secure mandate over former German Pacific territories, but watch their proposal for a racial equality clause in the League of Nations covenant, defeated by British Dominion opposition and American reluctance. The message is received. Japan may sit at the table of great powers, but it will not be treated as an equal. At home, the strain of empire presses downward. Rice riots erupt across the nation in the summer of 1918. Over 1 million participants in hundreds of cities and towns triggered by wartime inflation and rice hoarding. Textile mills employing young women from rural families generate export wealth, while workers endure 14-hour shifts in dormitory compounds. The empire expands outward even as internal pressures mount, and the distance between national ambition and domestic reality widens into a fault line that the next decades will split open. The fault line splits open in the 1920s. For a brief season, something resembling parliamentary democracy takes root. Universal male suffrage passes in 1925. Political parties compete for cabinet seats, and urban intellectuals debate liberalism in coffeehouses along the Ginza. But the same year that extends the vote also produces the Peace Preservation Law, granting police sweeping power to crush any movement threatening the Kokutai, the sacred national polity centered on the emperor. The two impulses, democratic opening and authoritarian closure, exist simultaneously, and the authoritarian current runs deeper. The global depression that begins in 1929 strikes Japan with particular cruelty. Silk prices collapse, devastating rural communities dependent on sericulture. Rice harvests fail in the northeast. Daughters are sold into urban labor or prostitution to keep families from starvation. Young army officers, many recruited from these same impoverished rural districts, watch their nation's civilian politicians with mounting contempt. They see corruption, Western decadence, party factionism, and they see Manchuria as the solution. The vast plains of northeastern China, rich in coal, iron, and soybeans, could feed the empire and free it from dependence on foreign resources. On the night of September 18, 1931, a small explosive charge detonates on the South Manchuria railway track near Mukden. The damage is so minor that a train passes over the site minutes later. But officers of the Kwantung Army, acting without authorization from Tokyo, declare Chinese sabotage and launch a full military offensive. Within 5 months, all of Manchuria falls under Japanese control. The civilian government in Tokyo, presented with a fait accompli by its own military, acquiesces. In March 1932, the puppet state of Manchukuo is proclaimed with the last Qing emperor, Puyi, installed as nominal head of state. When the League of Nations condemns the seizure, Japan simply withdraws from the organization in March 1933. International order, already fragile, cracks further. The pattern repeats domestically. On February 26, 1936, over 1,400 troops led by young officers of the 1st Division seize central Tokyo, assassinating the finance minister, the Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal, and the Inspector General of Military Education. They hold the government district for 3 days before the emperor himself demands suppression. The rebels surrender, and 17 are executed. Yet the incident's aftermath paradoxically strengthens military influence. Subsequent cabinets govern only with army and navy approval, and no civilian politician dares challenge military budgets or strategic decisions. The Marco Polo Bridge incident of July 7, 1937, ignites full-scale war with China. What begins as a skirmish near Beijing escalates within weeks into a continental invasion. Shanghai falls after months of brutal urban combat. Nanjing, the Chinese capital, is captured in December 1937, and Japanese troops perpetrate mass atrocities against civilians and prisoners of war over 6 weeks, killings, assaults, and destruction on a scale that shocks even Allied observers. The war in China becomes a quagmire consuming men, material, and moral standing, yet no faction in Tokyo possesses the political will to withdraw. By 1940, Japan signs the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy, formally aligning with European fascism. The United States responds with escalating economic sanctions, first scrap metal, then aviation fuel, and finally, in July 1941, a total embargo on oil exports to Japan. The Imperial Navy's fuel reserves will last 18 months at most. The choice narrows to withdrawal from China and diplomatic humiliation, or a strike southward to seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, which means war with Britain and America. On the morning of December 7, 1941, 353 aircraft launch from 6 carriers north of Hawaii. The first bombs fall on Pearl Harbor at 7:55 local time. The constitutional democracy that had flickered in the 20s is now wholly consumed by military command, and the empire commits itself to a war spanning the breadth of the Pacific Ocean. The speed of the initial advance stuns even its architects. Within hours of the Pearl Harbor strike, Japanese bombers destroy American air power on the ground in the Philippines. Within days, landings commence across Southeast Asia. Thailand capitulates within 5 hours. Malaya is invaded from the north. Wake Island and Guam fall before Christmas. The Imperial Army moves through jungle terrain that British planners had deemed impassable, cycling down dirt roads on the Malay Peninsula, outflanking fixed defensive positions one after another. On the 15th of February, 1942, the British garrison at Singapore surrenders, 80,000 troops marching into captivity in what Winston Churchill calls the worst disaster in British military history. The Rising Sun flag rises over the fortress that was supposed to anchor Western power in Asia. By April, the Philippines fall. Batan's defenders endure a forced march that kills thousands. The Dutch East Indies capitulate, delivering the oil fields that drove the entire strategic gamble. Burma is overrun, threatening India itself. In 6 months, Japan has seized a perimeter stretching from the Aleutian Islands to the borders of Australia, encompassing 3 million square miles of ocean and the resources of entire continents: rubber, tin, oil, rice. The Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere exists not merely as propaganda, but as occupied territory administered by military governors from Rangoon to Rabaul. The tide turns on a single morning. On the 4th of June, 1942, near Midway Atoll, American dive bombers locate 4 Japanese carriers with their flight decks cluttered. Aircraft being rearmed, fuel hoses snaking across wooden planking. In 5 minutes, 3 carriers are ablaze. The fourth follows hours later. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, the same ships that launched the Pearl Harbor attack, sink beneath the Pacific. Japan loses its offensive striking power and 248 irreplaceable naval aviators in a single day. The war of conquest becomes a war of attrition that industrial capacity will decide. From 1943 onward, American forces advance island by island: Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each island costs more blood. On Iwo Jima's black volcanic sand, 21,000 Japanese defenders fight nearly to the last man across 36 days of combat, beginning in February 1945. On Okinawa, the battle consumes 82 days and claims over 200,000 lives, soldiers and civilians alike. Kamikaze pilots, many of them university students barely 20 years old, dive their aircraft into American warships, sinking or damaging hundreds of vessels. Meanwhile, the home islands burn. On the night of March 9, 1945, 334 B-29 bombers fly low over Tokyo, dropping incendiary clusters on densely packed wooden neighborhoods. 16 square miles of the city are incinerated. Approximately 100,000 civilians die in a single night, more than either atomic bomb will immediately kill. Over the following months, 66 additional cities are firebombed. Kobe, Osaka, Nagoya, Yokohama, reduced to ash and twisted metal. The urban population scatters into the countryside, half-starved, the rice ration cut below subsistence. On the 6th of August, 1945, a single B-29 named Enola Gay releases one uranium bomb over Hiroshima at 8:15 in the morning. The blast kills approximately 80,000 people instantly. 3 days later, a plutonium device destroys Nagasaki, killing 40,000 more. Between the two bombs, the Soviet Union declares war and invades Manchuria, annihilating the Kwantung Army in days. On the 15th of August, a recorded voice crackles through radio speakers across the empire, the first time most subjects have ever heard their emperor speak. Hirohito's words are formal, archaic, almost incomprehensible in their indirection, yet the meaning is unmistakable. The war is lost. Japan accepts the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. Soldiers weep in barracks across the Pacific. Civilians kneel before radios in silence. The empire that stretched from Manchuria to the Solomon Islands contracts in an instant to the 4 home islands, scorched and starving, awaiting the arrival of an occupying army. The occupying army arrives not with vengeance but with chewing gum and canned rations. On the 30th of August, 1945, the first transports land at Atsugi Airfield, and General Douglas MacArthur descends the aircraft steps in khaki uniform, corncob pipe clenched between his teeth, into a country where 66 cities lie in ruins, where 9 million people are homeless, where industrial production has fallen to a fraction of pre-war levels, and where starvation threatens millions through the coming winter. Tokyo stretches in every direction as a plain of ash and twisted metal, punctuated by the occasional concrete shell of a bank or department store that withstood the firebombing. The Imperial Palace compound stands intact, deliberately spared, an island of green amid desolation. The photograph taken on the 27th of September defines the new order more eloquently than any decree. MacArthur stands relaxed, hands on hips, towering over Emperor Hirohito, who appears stiff and diminutive in formal morning dress. The image, published in every Japanese newspaper, communicates a single unmistakable fact. Sovereignty has shifted. Yet MacArthur makes a calculated decision to retain the emperor as a figurehead, understanding that Hirohito's cooperation will secure obedience from a population conditioned across centuries to revere the throne. The supreme commander for the Allied powers governs through existing Japanese bureaucracy, issuing directives that Japanese ministries implement. The reforms arrive in rapid succession. In October 1945, political prisoners are released, including communists jailed for decades. Women receive the vote, and in April 1946, 13 million women cast ballots for the first time. A sweeping land reform program breaks up absentee landlord estates, transferring ownership to tenant farmers. Within 3 years, owner-cultivated land rises from 54% to nearly 90%, dissolving the rural tenancy system that had bred poverty for generations. The new constitution, drafted largely by MacArthur's staff in a single week of February 1946, takes effect on the 3rd of May, 1947. Article 9 renounces war as a sovereign right and prohibits the maintenance of war potential. The emperor becomes a symbol of the state with no political power. A Bill of Rights guarantees freedoms unknown under the Meiji system. Meanwhile, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East convenes in Tokyo, trying 28 defendants for crimes against peace. 7 are hanged in December 1948, including former Prime Minister Tojo Hideki. The occupation's direction shifts dramatically when communist victory in China and the outbreak of war in Korea in June 1950 transform Japan from defeated enemy into indispensable ally. American military procurement orders flood Japanese factories, trucks, uniforms, communications equipment, ammunition. The Korean war boom injects billions of dollars into an economy still struggling with scarcity. Industrial production surges past pre-war levels by 1953. The occupation formally ends on the 28th of April, 1952, with the San Francisco Peace Treaty restoring sovereignty. What follows defies historical precedent. Government ministries coordinate with private conglomerates in a system of guided capitalism. The Ministry of International Trade and Industry channels investment toward steel, shipbuilding, chemicals, and eventually automobiles and electronics. Toyota and Nissan assembly lines multiply. Sony transistor radios reach global markets. Annual growth rates average nearly 10% through the 1960s. On the 1st of October, 1964, the Shinkansen bullet train inaugurates service between Tokyo and Osaka, covering the distance in 4 hours at speeds exceeding 200 kilometers per hour. 10 days later, the Tokyo Olympics open before a global television audience, a nation presenting itself reborn, its new national stadium rising on the site where soldiers once drilled. By 1968, Japan's gross domestic product surpasses West Germany's, making it the second largest economy on Earth. The archipelago that lay in ashes barely 2 decades earlier now manufactures the ships, the steel, and the televisions that the world consumes. The samurai's sword has been reforged into something entirely different, yet the discipline, the collective will, and the capacity for total national mobilization remain recognizable beneath the surface of this astonishing transformation. The economic miracle does not plateau, it accelerates into euphoria. Through the 1970s, Japan absorbs oil shocks that cripple Western economies, restructuring toward electronics, automobiles, and precision manufacturing with a discipline that seems almost inherited. By the early 1980s, Japanese corporations dominate global markets in semiconductors, cameras, and steel. Tokyo's Kabutocho Stock Exchange hums with frantic energy. Then the Plaza Accord of 1985 forces the yen's rapid appreciation, and the Bank of Japan responds with loose monetary policy that inflates asset prices beyond all rational measure. By 1989, the land beneath the Imperial Palace in Tokyo is theoretically worth more than all the real estate in California. Neon bathes Shinjuku in electric color. Department stores sell gold-flaked desserts. The Nikkei index peaks at nearly 39,000 on the last trading day of the decade. The collapse arrives with the new year of 1991. Stock prices plummet, real estate values dissolve. Banks discover their loan books are anchored to phantom wealth. What follows is not a sharp recession, but a slow, grinding deflation, the lost decade that becomes two lost decades. Factories close in provincial cities. Shopping arcades that once bustled fall silent behind shuttered storefronts. Rural schools consolidate as villages empty of young families. Japan's population, which peaked at 128 million in 2008, begins an unprecedented decline. Maternity wards close while elder care facilities multiply. Beneath the economic stagnation, older wounds demand attention. The question of wartime responsibility refuses resolution. When Prime Minister Koizumi Junichiro visits Yasukuni Shrine 6 times between 2001 and 2006, where 14 Class A war criminals are enshrined alongside millions of ordinary dead, diplomatic crises erupt with China and Korea. The shrine's Torii Gate becomes a fault line between those who see honoring the war dead as patriotic duty and those who see it as denial of imperial aggression. Textbook controversies, comfort women debates, and competing historical narratives keep the past perpetually present. Article 9 of the Constitution, renouncing war and the maintenance of war potential, remains the most contested legal text in Japanese public life. Successive governments reinterpret its boundaries, maintaining self-defense forces that rank among the world's most capable militaries, while insisting they exist only for defense. The tension between pacifist identity and strategic reality intensifies as China's military power grows and North Korean missiles arc over Japanese territory. On the 30th of April, 2019, Emperor Akihito completes something unprecedented, a voluntary abdication, the first in over 2 centuries. His reign, the Heisei era, spanned the bubble's collapse, the Kobe earthquake of 1995 that killed over 6,000, the Shinrikyo nerve gas attack on Tokyo's subway, the tsunami and nuclear disaster at Fukushima in 2011, and the slow reckoning with demographic decline. His son ascends as Emperor Naruhito, inaugurating the Reiwa era, its characters meaning beautiful harmony. In 2020, Tokyo hosts the Olympics for a second time, but the stadium stands largely empty, sealed by pandemic restrictions. The ceremony unfolds before cameras rather than crowds, a strange echo of a nation accustomed to presenting its best face to the world under constrained circumstances. Ancient castle keeps still rise above modern cities. Himeji's white plaster walls visible for kilometers. Kumamoto's stone foundations rebuilt after earthquake damage. Kendo practitioners strike in gymnasium halls with bamboo swords, their movements descending from techniques codified 4 centuries ago. Corporate loyalty, consensus decision-making, the aesthetic of restraint, the reverence for craft and precision, these carry forward from a warrior culture transformed but never fully extinguished. The chrysanthemum throne endures, the world's oldest monarchy presiding over a constitutional democracy that renounces the imperial ambitions once pursued in its name. The archipelago remains what geography always made it, volcanic, mountainous, bounded by the sea, carrying the full weight of its history into whatever comes next. Thank you for joining this journey through the complete history of Japan. If these stories brought the past to life for you, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new exploration of the worlds that shaped our own.